Hi everyone, this is Kavitha and welcome back to episode 3 of our Unwired series. Today we're going to talk about the big elephant in the room, content and messaging, and how do you create content that's powerful and meaningful. Over the years, I've received a lot of questions from people on how do I write and put these things together. I'm not going to be trying to teach you how to overcome writer's block here, but I'm really going to ask you to start thinking about how you're structuring your messaging to build effective thought leadership. To put it simply, your content for business needs to fit into one of the following 3 levels. One, that it's strategic, where you're sort of setting the stage. 2, it's tactical, where you're giving people insights into things. Or 3, that it's operational, where it's really providing people with advice. So in this episode, we're going to deep dive into these 3 areas and answer some of the questions people have been asking us. Let's move on. So let's start by talking about strategic content, also known as thought leadership. What does this look like? Usually, strategic content can come in many forms like storytellers, point of views, columns, or market where you're forecasting or trend setting. On that note, let's read the first question. For the audience's sake, can we differentiate between content and messaging? Of course we can. Content is really what you're putting together. Messaging is what you want your audience to actually feel, think, or be inspired from. Although they need to work together, they mean 2 different things. So if you don't have powerful content, which is aware of how you're trying to make your audience feel, then you've lost out. The second question says, what techniques or frameworks have you found most useful and effective in writing content that makes people feel inspired? I've always found that starting by telling stories or giving examples, substantiating things with facts and figures, makes people feel more engaged. You want to know what's happening in the world. You want to know what another person's thinking. Or maybe you want to start with something a very famous personality did. These are very important elements when it comes to engaging your audience, especially when it comes to strategic content. When you say strategic, think thought leadership. Think how you want to build a leadership position, not a follower, but someone who sets the trend. Now let's talk about what I mean by tactical content. Tactical content is always about actually giving people insights to tell them how they can improve or benefit. So these types of content or messaging tends to look at things like process setting, defining roadmaps, maybe case studies, having some sort of graphical representations. So related to that, let's take 2 important questions that I've really received. One says, what types of content have you found to be effective in increasing engagement, readership, or simply reaching out to your target market? I think tactical content needs to have a very strong visual sense. This needs to be able to summarize to people very quickly your thoughts, present it to them in a visual, colorful manner. So even if they don't have a lot of time to start reading, they can get the gist of what you're talking about. So typically things like ebooks, which are illustrated beautifully, mailers that look effective, colorful, and are organized very neatly, infographics, very important, or blogs where people are actually giving actionable advice or talking about operational things, which will leave the reader thinking, maybe if I tried that, it would help me. The next question, how does one ensure that their content provides clear, actionable takeaways that helps your audience solve a real business problem? I think the answer is in the question. You need to really state the problem and take people from there to actually how they unravel their way to solving this issue. So, any sort of actionable content needs to be presented in a very, very clear way, using steps and guiding people in a simple, straightforward manner. So, if you think flowcharts or infographics, where you are describing the issue, you're talking about things that challenge that, things that could improve or benefit, and then finally the result or the success that you could gain from this. So, any content in this manner needs to take people from their issue to the benefits in a logical format. So think visual when it comes to something like this. If you're presenting this content on stage, let's say via an event or using a presentation, you can really transform and give them this content even in an event experience. You need to be aligned, clear slides, taking people from their problem to solution, and you need to be able to give them measurable, actionable tips that they can then relate back to. And finally, we're going to be talking about operational content. I think this is one of the most important areas because once you've set the tone and once you've sort of established your leadership, you need to really start talking about things like your solutions and operational topics, reaching out to a far wider audience. And this really involves things like tips and tricks, tools, telling people what can they actually use, what are the hacks and things like that to be able to benefit from what you're talking about. So in this case, what does this look like? Typically, it can look like defining specific tasks, specific tips that you may want to give them, or takeaways that they should be looking for. So on this, let's go for the questions. The first question says, what are your go-to tips for crafting content, operational content, that grabs attention? Operational content sometimes can look very dense and heavy. Think about if you're doing technical writing and you want to really start talking about your solution. If you go into pages and pages or hours and hours of technical explanations, you're going to lose people very quickly. So my tip has always been, don't say something for 2 hours if you can say it in 2 minutes. So whatever content you have, you can continue to explain, but make sure you're able to pull out some things. Have sections that say quick tips. Have things that say, here's what you should be looking for. Have attention grabbers. So if people don't have 10 minutes to read, but they have 10 seconds, they can still take something away every second. Again, this translates back to being on stage. People sometimes land up, and you've seen it so many times. You've only got 50 slides and you want to run through 50 slides. Seriously? I think you as a speaker can do better with your life, and I think your audience can do better too. So make it quick, make it easy, make it meaningful. So when they look at it, they think he's actually taught me something. The next question is for writers. Of course, I was a writer, I am a writer, and I so understand where this comes from. It says, what's a common mistake you see often, and what's a simple fix that writers can apply? I think one of the big problems we writers face is we write too much. I've always told people who worked with me, you don't need to write something that can be said in 200 words and give it 10,000 words. I think by making your writing crisp, strong, and short, you deliver a far greater punch. One of the things you need to do when you're writing something, which then is going to go on to form the basis of what you're saying in presentations, videos, mailers, whatever it may be, is to really think about the punchline. Start with the strongest point that you're going to make. Let the reader know that by reading this piece, I'm actually going to learn a specific thing. So you need to frame your structure. So with a very strong intro, talks about the problem, talks about the solution, and go on from there. So I think this is one thing that writers need to keep in mind. Think before you write, structure before you write. It's not the same process if you are writing a novel, if you're doing business writing, if you're writing for an audience. You need to have a process and a structure. And finally, the last question. Can I share a quick tip for content writing workflows in general? Of course, I can. And one of this goes back to the very, very important rule when you're writing. I think a lot of people who've been in media might know this. It's called the inverted pyramid. What you need to do is, first of all, do a workflow for what you're trying to say. The inverted pyramid means you put the most important, biggest fact or takeaway right on top, followed by the body that substantiates it, and then put whatever else you want to say at the bottom. So that needs to be the workflow. So this way, you're not missing people from reading the most important things that you want to talk about. And with that, we come to the end of this episode on content and messaging. We hope you found it useful. Please let us know if there are other questions that you'd like us to talk about or answer. We'd be more than happy to reach out. Thank you.